Evening, leaders, or good afternoon, or good morning, wherever you are. You might be in one country or the other around the world. It's our joy to welcome you to this broadcast today, and I hope you've had a very good day. If not, like I always say, the day is just about to get even better. So, welcome to this broadcast, and it's a pleasure to see you indeed. Um, just for to mention, we had a few series that we've done over the last few weeks that I want to recommend to every one of us to take a look at. So you might just, after this broadcast, want to pop to our YouTube channel where you will see a series of trainings that we've done over time. So make use of them, and I'm sure you'll be glad you did. So I also mentioned a few initiatives that we're starting right from this month of August, and they are designed to actually bring about the best in everyone that is on this broadcast. I'm very glad that leaders are emerging, and I know that you also are about to take that next step into discovering the true leader that you are. I mean, I'm convinced about one thing, that everyone who is on this platform is committed to personal leadership development, and that's been our focus um, since the beginning of this year. So just let's ride along as we enjoy this broadcast that is titled "The World of Leaders." And by the way, next week is an event you don't want to miss, because we're having Trista to crack with us. Trista is based out there in Florida. She's a businesswoman. She runs a very large hotel business in Florida, in Naples actually. And I'm sure she might even be on this broadcast listening to us. And she's coming along to do a presentation that is titled Visionary Leadership. She qualifies to do that because not only is her business really making tremendous impact, she's also raising leaders around the world who are beginning to go into different spheres of influence. So I'm sure we want to be around next week to partake in that event. Today, we're looking at the word of the leader, and there are a few things were running through my mind when I was preparing for this. So you'll see that byline that says cultivating strategies for influencing the leader's domain. By that, um, each one of us has a domain of influence. If you take a look at some of the series we did, especially last month, we spoke extensively about the domains and how that actually how each leader has a particular sphere of influence. So we're looking now at how to make the right kind of impact or influence in that domain. So we're looking at principles. This might be a series. So today we're focusing on this aspect where we're looking at the principles of leadership influence. And our specific focus today is how to influence through impact without imposing. I said the other time that the purest form of leadership is inspiration. And inspiration is the kind of leadership that comes about without coercion or without manipulation. Because as a matter of fact, once a person begins to manipulate or coerce people to do things, he might be a leader still, but that adjective in front of it, true leader, that adjective called true, is already being cancelled, because true leadership occurs by inspiration. So our focus is to look at how to influence through inspiration without imposition. So, well, we have a few things that we want to look at very briefly. That's understanding the context of the earth and the world. What do we mean when we say the earth? Well, I'm sure everybody knows, but there's a context I want us to look at today, which we bring this to light. And then also want to look at what we mean when we say the world. Well, I'm sure for as long as we've learned to speak English, or most of us already know what world means, but I would dare say that maybe not in this context. Now, by the way, if you're very new to this platform, we very much welcome interaction. So I want to encourage us to, drop a comment, say hello to other leaders, and also, if you have a question, please put it in that chat facility, and let's treat those questions. Let's learn from your perspective as we continue to grow together. Okay, so now one other thing we want to look at is to discover the world's governing systems. What do we mean by world's governing system? There was a hint of that when we were looking at the topic we considered last month. So you might want to look at that again. So we're looking at governing systems, and we're also looking at how to discover the principles of influence. The principles of influence. And of course, to discover strategies for effective influence. The thing is this: we all have knowledge, and knowledge that we have are in different forms and shapes and to different degrees. But the key thing is, how do we use what we know to make a difference? How do we birth a change through the knowledge that we already have? When I'm speaking about this, there's a slight bias I have towards people who have, who think about God. Now, that way of life, or that, let me use that world opens us to a specialized form of knowledge, which has a capacity to actually birth a new world, if I must say so. But there's a missing link, which is that we've not been shown how to use that knowledge to actually make our communities or even our nations better. So, and that's what we want to begin to look at in this series. Another objective, which is the last on that list, well, last but not the least, is to say that discovering the purpose of leadership influence. Why does a leader need to be the influence that he is or she is? What is the purpose of influence? Okay, now a few concepts and context here, just to make sure we're on the same page with respect to each of these terminologies. Now, when we're talking about the Earth, we actually are talking about the physical planet, or what the Spanish will use that word, and also it's a word around the Andalusians. They call it tierra, and that simply means the territory. Now, when we're talking about the Earth, we can break that down to the various places where we live. Some people live in the Americas, some people live in Europe, in Africa, in Asia. As a matter of fact, some of them are on this broadcast. Now, the portion of the Earth where you live is what you would refer to as a country, and even that is broken down further into your local community. Now, all of that is tierra, or just your piece of the Earth. Now, where we are really focusing a bit more tonight is that context that we call world. And when we're talking about world, I was looking into the dictionary and I saw a few definitions, which is actually helping me to put this in proper context. Now, by that we mean by the biosphere. We mean the domain or the sphere, the realm of existence, or the sphere of life. Okay, now you see how this actually comes together. There's another word that I introduced a while ago, which is a Greek word for world, and it's called cosmos. And I was checking again today, and by definition, it means the orderly or harmonious systems that influence human actions. That's orderly and harmonious systems that influence human action. And that suggests to me that one way or the other, we are being influenced by at least one cosmos, at least. And I dare say that there are definitely more than one. We're being influenced by um, various worlds, which we're going to look at a bit more as we go on. Now, still talking about world, we mean governing systems and domains of influence. As a matter of fact, we are not just being impacted by one or many worlds, we are also actors in at least one world. Okay, so now when we're now talking about strategy, a very specific meaning in this context is having an intentional plan, an approach, and policy of action. In other words, when we're talking about the strategy of influence, we are looking at having not leaving anything to chance, but having an intentional plan. And the word intentional there should actually have been highlighted, which is that unless there is an intentional plan, well, the world will remain as it is. There's a statement that I think I've quoted a few times, that some folks watch change happen. Some folks do not even know that change is happening. But there's another portion of people who actually initiate change. They put their hands into making changes happen. And that's what we're talking about, having intentional plan, deliberate plan, or deliberate approach, and having deliberate policies that guide our actions. And by influence in this case, what we mean is effect, impact, or guidance, all of that accumulating into this context or this concept of inspiration. I don't want that word inspiration to ever go away in our conversations, because that is the purest form of leadership that I would like to really talk about all the time on this platform. Okay, now when we're talking about the earth and the world, and I put just kind of put a plural in that place, I've done this diagram just to put that into context so that we can see the relationships among certain elements that we are familiar with. So you can see the earth, but the earth, like I said, the way it applies to each individual is that you are in a particular nation of the earth. That's why we say nations of the earth. Earth, like nations, are territories which have definite boundaries, and you can identify them on the map. But there is the layer that is above the earth or the nations, and that sometimes is intangible, but the effects are so clearly felt, and that's what we call the world, which is the systems, the influence, the governing systems around the world, around the earth and the nations. And of course, in the world, what you find are systems. So the world itself might be so big. It's big and covers territories, but the world itself can be fragmented into systems that relate in some kind of order or harmony, or sometimes disharmony. But you could see that there's an interconnectivity between the systems in a particular world. And therefore, if I go to reference the Bible very quickly, you will see how that placed together. You will see that what that says the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. Of course, in the earth, that's where you find your minerals. You find oil, you find diamond, you find gas, you find, quartz, quartzite, you find all of the minerals. You find the trees, you find the animals, lions, and all of that. And all of those elements are in various nations. But look at the second part, the world and the people therein. Now, that's the key thing that I want us to keep very close to our mind as we go through this discourse. We're talking about world, but there is something in the world. And I think I'm probably going ahead of myself now. It is people that are in the world. Just like it is people that are in the nations, and it is people that are on the earth. Of course, humans are not alone. We have all the other earth life. But the case in now is about our own influence with respect to the mandate we have to look after the earth. Right. So talking now about spheres of influence, there is a verse that I want to bring to light, which is in fact a command. And most of us will be familiar with this. But let's see what it says. Go into all the world or all the nation. And we know that whether you read go into all the world or go into all the nations, we know that worlds are in nations. In other words, upon the physical territory of earth, we have the world. So whether you fragment those into nations or the whole world as an entity, you have world or worlds over the earth and over the respective nations. So now that word, just to look at our capacity and the sphere of influence, the scope, for people who are familiar with business processes and business analysis and all that, or project management, you always define the scope through which you are exercising your activity. So go into all the world, and world here is talking about systems of orderly and harmonious realms of influence. So the mandate, the instruction is to go into every system. So, I mean, we need to put this out of the way just to know that there is it's not about, oh, okay, I can afford not to. This is a mandate for every human. Now, the one thing I wanted to highlight very quickly is that when we're talking about the world or the system, we should know that the world itself, the world as a whole, as a big entity, has many worlds in it. And those are the things we call the system. So there are systems of the world. There are systems in the world, or the world has many worlds in it as fragments, which are ordered and exist in some form of harmony. Okay. Now, I mentioned that word earlier on, cosmos, just for the sake of emphasis, repetition for the sake of emphasis and making it permanent. Some people use the word indoctrination, but it's to say we are repeating it just so that it becomes something that we think about, very closely. So cosmos, for our definition, means governing systems. Governing systems. In other words, systems which are governed and therefore are ordered and exist in some form of harmony. Now, every human, like we said, is influenced by these systems. Not just being influenced, every human is actually an influencer in one way or the other. So the systems are present in all the nations of the earth. You remember that diagram that I showed the other time? The systems are present. That's why I deliberately put the world and the system into the bigger onion, into the bigger layer of the onion, to show that the systems are present in all the nations of the earth. So which means Whatever nation, or in fact, whatever city you live in the world, the systems are present in that part of your world. So if you are in London, you have the systems, and depending sometimes on how metropolitan your city is, you may actually find all of the world present in your nation. Some local environments that are not that big might find some of the systems, but the key thing is all of the world is influenced by all of the systems. So now, talking about governance systems, I wanted us to just show what we mean when we are talking about them, because it's very easy to think about something else. But let's bring it home and see how that these indeed are things that affect all of us. So I have one on the screen. In fact, I have a number of them, and these are by no means the exhaustive list, but just to put out a few. Banking and finance, or banking and finance, as some will call it, that's a governance system. And you know that as long as you have one note or one coin or a card in your wallet, then you are being governed or influenced by that system. So banking and finance. Insurance. Well, depending on some where you live, some people are actually being heavily influenced by that word. Law. Tell me about that. Law is something that influences every nation, every community on the earth. And I'm sure you have your own list. You can begin to draw your own list and see if it matches some of the items I have. I will show in a moment. Okay. Health, the world of healthcare, or call it the world of medicine. You also have pharmaceuticals in that area as well. And tell me about how that influences every one of us. Education. I mean, if you have ever been to any school whatsoever, or have read any material, so you can tell that you have been influenced by that world. Politics, that's a big one. And we know exactly what we do every 4 or every 5 years in our various nations. Even when people are not eligible to vote, you still are influenced by the decision of that world. And as a matter of fact, only today I was sent a copy of electoral register just to, indicate that I'm qualified to vote. So that is a world that influences all of us. Talk about arts and entertainment. Well, the music that you hear, whether on the radio, on the TV, the various arts and all of that, the media. Well, as a matter of fact, in this day and age, we have 24/7 media outlets, and how much they impact the world. Sports, depending on which country you live in. If you live in a country such as I do, and you begin to know how that sports, as a matter of fact, is a very big world, commanding tremendous influence. Agriculture, as a matter of fact, that's probably one of the oldest that we have in the world. Defense, every country has its own defense system, defense department, and that is another governance system. Engineering, I mean, the list goes on, and I can continue to. I think that there are about 26, but I only have, I think, about 16 on this page. Food, the food industry. Well, that's related to agriculture, but it's another word on its own. Mining, the explorative department or the world. Religion, that's a very big one. That's has its pros and cons. So these are quite just a number of the governance systems that we do have, and they are by no means exhaustive, but just to show a snapshot of the worlds that influence us from day to day. So when you're seeing that injunction that says go into all the world, so we know exactly what that means. That is saying go into banking and finance. It's saying go into insurance, go into law, go into health or into healthcare, and so on and so forth. So it's we're not dealing with ambiguities. We're talking about very, very specific elements, very, very specific words. Talk about the world of building and construction, the world of architecture. So now the principle that we're talking about the other time is that going into all of these worlds is not something that we can do in a blindfolded fashion. We must be able to go into those worlds with intentionality. Intentionally go into them in a purposeful manner, to not just be influenced by them, but to also bear the right kind of influence into this world. And you can tell that you don't need to leave your city to be in these worlds. You don't need to leave your country to be in these worlds. So when we're talking about being able to influence the governing systems, we are talking about being able to have a strategic means of going into this world. I mean, I don't want to beat it further than I've done, but I think that context, is probably, very clear in your mind as I'm speaking. So, talking about strategic influence, influence connotes presence of multiple actors. Tell me about that. Because is either you are influencing or you're being influenced, and that already talks about at least two parties, either the influencer or the influenced. So influence, as a consequence, does not operate in a vacuum. So you cannot influence nothing. So influence does not operate in a vacuum. And just to chip this in very quickly, when we're talking about the word strategic, it's talking about one, choice. In other words, deciding out of a number of options, deciding to go after a specific one or specific ones. It's also talking about some kind of plan and some kind of timed event, which might be long term, but most of the time long term. So when we're talking about strategic influence, we're talking about the kind of influence that is, planned, or call it planned and long-term influence. So effective leadership influence, therefore, requires intentional integration. I mean, look at the words that I mentioned just on the previous slide. The point is, unless you are in the world of agric, you have little or no influence in that world at all. Unless you are in the world of banking and finance, you bear little, in fact, most of the time, no influence in that area. And this is the context that I want us to bear in mind very strongly as we go on. So effective leadership influence, or effective influence, just put it at that, requires intentional integration. And I've used the word effective to mean that if that influence is to bear result, intended result, then it's got to be intentional. Okay. And another thing is this: we cannot influence without interaction. Interaction and integration seem to go hand in hand. You integrate so that you can interact. An effective interaction cannot occur without integration. I mean, it seems to be a play of words, but sometimes it's good to repeat items just for the sake of, reinforcing the idea. Okay. I've said it before, I think, in one of our previous sessions, but I want to mention this again, and I think I'll do a bit more justice into it. Talking about yeast. Yeast, as a matter of fact, is a kind of fungi. Is a kind of fungi, and the way it works is, in fact, it's been around all through these ages, and is a very interesting organism. And when you go to the store and you have yeast on the shelf of the store, it's lying very quietly, innocently in the pack. And at that point, it really can do nothing. So yeast is just rubbing shoulder with yeast and totally ineffective in the pack. So, like I said, it's a living organism. But yeast comes into its own when it comes into the dough. Now, let's look at the interaction between the yeast and the dough. Yeast, by comparison, is much, much more smaller than the dough. As a matter of fact, if you put a measure of dough on the ground or in a bowl, yeast looks totally insignificant compared to the dough. Okay? But yeast can only influence the dough through integration. So it is not the size of the yeast that limits its influence, but the lack of integration does. So if yeast must indeed influence the dough, it's got to leave the pack and go right into the dough to integrate for the purpose of influence. That's why that verse that I read the other time, go into all the world. Go into. The word into is talking about integration. Go integrate yourself into the world. Why? For the purpose of intentional influence. Okay. Yeast, even though it goes into the dough, it retains its identity. Yeast does not become dough. But it's very interesting that once yeast goes into the dough, it can no longer be extracted. And that's why that statement that says go into the dough, it didn't say return. It does not talk about being extracted again. Go in there and just disappear into the world. But let the influence be clear and doubtless. So yeast can no longer be extracted once it is in the dough. And yeast has its power of influence in the dough. That's why I said that if you put yeast together in the pack, well, all it can do is just be there innocently looking and has no power of influence. Yeast comes into its own once it gets into the dough. And people who bake, can testify to what I'm saying. Now, what is the significance of this? I will read a story. All through last month, we spoke about, the kingdom of God and all that, and what that actually means. And I did say that all of that has nothing to do with religion. Let's get that out of the way once and for all. But it was saying this, that the kingdom of God, talking about a country, is like the real influence of, I spoke that I said kingdom means government. So the government of God, or government, in fact, governmental influence actually happens in this manner. It's like a yeast which a woman, I wonder why I actually use a woman in that tense, but well, let's say women do more of that than men. Well, apologies, but it says a particular person, man or woman, takes that yeast and puts it into 60 pounds of dough. And in time, it takes over. Now, something about yeast, you will notice that for yeast to actually take over the dough, there are two things that it needs. It needs moisture. In fact, three things at least. It needs moisture, it needs heat, and it needs pressure. That's a whole lot of discussion on its own. So Now, talking about being agents of transformation, there's another strategy of influence. So, if I just back up a bit to that previous slide, the key strategy there is the strategy of integration or intentional integration. Now, let's look at another strategy here. And this is, look, I send you into the world as sheep. Now, the word as sheep is what is a simile. It means in comparison to a sheep, the same way a sheep will look among wolves. Wolves, I watched a documentary on wolves, and they don't actually go, they hardly go as lone rangers, hardly ever. Most of the time, they go in packs. That's why you hear the word a pack of wolves. They go. So now imagine a sheep within a pack of wolves. You can tell that that day all the wolves are smiling. This is food. So now when it says, look, the way I'm sending you is as sheep among wolves, it means you actually look totally unthreatening. Sheep are animals that are known not to have the upper is it canine now? Is it canine or insist that upper teeth, which means they are totally unthreatening, and sheep actually look very friendly. That's why people will carry them. You can carry them, you can move them about, very friendly. So it's talking about one strategy is to enter into a world you cannot be threatening. It must be a friendly, amiable disposition. Now, the second strategy there, she said, so therefore, the purpose of being friendly is for access, to be able to get access into that specific world. So it then says this, once you enter, you have to transform. That's why I spoke about, I wrote there, agent of transformation. You have to transform as serpent. You are not serpent, but similarly, just like serpent. And what does a serpent do? Serpents are known to be very wise, adaptable, as a matter of fact, knowledgeable. Serpents can go through tiny holes and contour their bodies. Serpents can camouflage. Serpents are, let me use this word in a positive sense, they are schemers. A serpent can scheme his way out of any situation. A serpent sometimes hypnotizes the animal. So if a serpent is moving towards a rodent, it begins to kind of open and close its eyes, so that it begins to flash like as it were, dazzle the rodent. It hypnotizes it, dazzles it. It's talking about some of those three words, among others: being wise, being adaptable, and being knowledgeable. Then it says, once the serpent is close enough, has gathered enough knowledge, knows the environment, knows the system, it said you have to remember that the serpent, the agent of transformation in that environment, is not there to cause harm, is there to transform into dove, as dove. And doves are known to be peaceful. As a matter of fact, I'm told that doves do not have bile. Bile is that substance and that is it organ in most animals that has something very bitter, gall. And I'm told that doves don't have it. I'm going to do a bit more research into that. But it's talking about being peaceful and being able to reconcile the system. Now, reconciliation to and for what? For what? We're going to look at that shortly. So, influence requires adaptation, but not adoption. In other words, when we go into world, is to be able to adapt to the world, to the system, but not to adopt the ways of the system. This is very key. Influence requires intentional access, and influence requires purposeful integration. Now, let's look at the purpose of being in the systems or in the world. So when I talk about world, I mean everyone agrees with it now. We're talking about systems of influence, systems, harmonious, uh, orderly systems. Now look at this statement again. Just still continuing from that verse that I started to read. Go into the world, and the second part or the next part says, "Make disciples of every nation." What does this mean? Does it mean to go and become a proselyte? No, not at all. At least in my own context. The injunction is to make nations students. The word disciples is actually a word that was invented a long time ago. And I suppose perhaps even preceding the Greek era. And what it would do is there will be students who come and begin to follow what they call a master teacher. And a master teacher actually has a body of knowledge, or what you call a school of knowledge, that the disciple is interested in learning. And all of that school of knowledge is in the mind of the master teacher. So that's where the concept of schools actually came from. It's talking about a school or a body or a library of knowledge. Okay, so in that context, disciples simply means students. So the injunction to make students of every nation means to make disciples of every nation simply means make students of every nation. Right. Now, what does nation mean? Is the word there ethnos. The word ethnos simply means ethnic grouping of people. It means people who have specific culture that identifies them. So ethnos, is right there, a group that is distinct by culture. So you can relate that to some of those words that I showed earlier on. So when you're looking at banking and finance, law, there is a culture in each of those environments, each of those systems. Now, the word make indicates intentional action. That's why I was talking about intentionality. So the word make is a word that is deliberate, is a word that is very, very purposeful. In fact, when you say you make someone to do something, it's almost in the context of inducing something to do a particular thing, or someone to do a particular thing. Right. So the capacity, this is where I'm going, to create and influence the conditions of influence and change resides in every individual through the exercise of the gift they have and their power of character. In other words, imagine someone who is an employee, say for example, in a bank, and maybe is meant to resume at 9 o'clock, for example, but consistently is there at 10 o'clock. Now, it might be a good accountant, but something else is lacking. The gift is there, but there is no character to back it up. And what that simply means is, something happens, begin to lose respect. I'll come to that in a while. So let's look at this now, purposeful education or purposeful re-education. Now, the next phrase there, or the next clause says, teaching them. Teaching them. Now, teaching indicates the capacity to educate, which means if somebody says, teach me, it means that you have the capacity to educate. Teaching indicates possession of requisite knowledge. It means you have the knowledge that is required and that can be impacted into someone else. Teaching implies levels of understanding beyond that of the student. I remember my very first teaching exercise in the industry, and this was actually in the oil industry. And I was a very young man at the time, just kind of stepping into my professional career. And suddenly, a more senior colleague who was taking the class just said, well, at this time, we will now invite so person to take on the class. I mean, I was shocked because I'd gone around to look at the registration form, and I saw the experience of all of these people, and I thought, oh my God, these people have so much experience, and I'm just starting. It was my first year in the profession. So I thought I was intimidated actually by the years of knowledge. But something interesting happened. The moment I stood in front of the class to teach, everyone was looking at me, expecting me to teach. So in some way, they believe that for me to be called to stand in front of the class, then I have something that they can learn. So when you are asked to go and teach them, it means that you have the capacity to educate. Now, it also indicates that the authority of the teacher lies in our capacity to impact knowledge to the student. And people who have taught can testify to this. If you have ever taught at any point in time, especially if you are teaching like junior schools and all that, your authority actually lies in the fact that you know your subject. A teacher that we had at a point when I was in secondary school who taught us additional mathematics. Each time this man comes, even though he was a very strict man, we knew that this man knows his subject and that he could teach it. So we're looking forward to the class. And when he comes in, everybody is paying rapt attention because he had the authority to teach his subject and he knew his work. So the teacher, therefore, knows more and is expected to be wiser than the student, at least in the context of applying the knowledge. So when we're talking about teaching them, it means that there is something that we bring into those environments that is meant to be taught to the environment. We'll look at that in a while, shortly now. So what qualifies you to teach? Look at that. Teaching them to observe all that I taught you. It means that you have been taught something that the systems need. And the word observe is the word to witness, to pay attention, to prove to be right, or to be a witness to something. So it's not actually just it means to actually to demonstrate in the context of witness. It means you can prove that it actually works. So to observe all that I taught you has this following connotations. That you are, say, in fact, before I go too further, this is a statement I want to bring out now. You are the light of the world. So what qualifies you to teach is that you have been taught, and by that teaching, you have become something. You have become the light of the, what is the word? Systems. So you have become the light of the systems. Now, I was checking through my research, and I found that the word light means knowledge. And of course, when you use the word darkness, it means ignorance in the Greek context or in the Hebraic context. So when it says you are the light of the world, this is what it means. It means you are the knowledge. let me just let you say it. You are the knowledge that the systems need. I mean, how this is a shock in some perspective. It means, now the question is this: if you look at any system that you observe, they seem to be functioning very well, and as a matter of fact, they do. But it's saying that relative to what you are to teach them, they still are in darkness. I mean, that is almost insulting. But it brings us something very vital, that there is something that you have been taught, especially within the context of understanding the kingdom of God, that makes you the knowledge that the systems need. And all that the world knows is equated to darkness. So imagine somebody who's a professor in physics. I mean, that takes a great, tremendous amount of effort. But this seems to be comparing that to all of that to darkness. And what darkness means ignorance, which means there's still something that the world needs to know, and you have been asked to teach that. Now, the question is this: is the world really in darkness without your light? And if that's the case, what is that light? Now, unless you integrate purposefully, it therefore means one thing, that darkness abides. Think about that. What you are taught by the master teacher is actually your qualification to teach. But don't forget that we said that something the other time, which I'm going to highlight more. So, if this is the case, why then is influence limited? Why does it seem that, yes, you have light, yes, but could it be, let me ask this question, could it be that yeast is only in a pack and has never made its way into the dough? Or could it be that yeast is still in an envelope or in some kind of cellophane paper and then injected into the dough, which means it's actually in the dough, but it's wrapped up in nylon? Think about that. So going into the systems without authority is one of the limitations of intentional influence. What does that mean? You cannot go into a world and influence it unless you have the authority to. Okay, I'll explain that a bit more. Going without earning the respect of the system is one of the things that limits influence. And respect is earned by surviving an experience that is valuable to the systems. In other words, you cannot demand respect. You have to earn it. And unless the system trusts you or respects you, they will not listen. So you have to earn the respect of a student in order for the student to submit to teaching. So if you have been asked to teach and to make students, now, I mean, it will be preposterous for someone to think that someone will just come to teach if there's nothing that the person can actually teach. So which means being capacity to earn the respect, to be able to open the doors. And there are things that open doors. Actually, if you look at it in your various careers or various spheres of influence, there are things that open doors that you don't even need to be the one to run to knock. The system actually opens the door to you and asks you to come in. Because why? Like sheep is to the wolf, the sheep benefits the wolf. Unless the system sees you as a benefit to it, it shuts its door. And actually, as a matter of fact, every system has its door. So inability to integrate in an ethnos limits influence. So it's not just being present, it's about integrating. Now, if you look at some of our countries, there's a problem about certain nationals not being able to integrate into that nation. Now, they are present, but cannot integrate. And that is bringing social conflict because they're thinking, okay, they're here now, but what's the benefit of being here if we cannot integrate? So integration requires the ability not just to be present, but to be able to interact in a beneficial way. So inability to integrate in an ethnos. An ethnos in that case means groupings of people, ethnic backgrounds, actually, that's what it means. So why should anyone listen to you against this background? What is it that you have that the world actually needs for which they will invite you and listen to you? And I must tell you, the business is actually about winning hearts and minds. There's a man, a fourth century teacher, actually a lawyer, and he made a statement. He said, "I become all things to all men, that I may win them." Now, winning them, what was he winning? He was winning hearts and minds, and that's what you call soul. He was actually winning the souls of people. And talking about that, I think we mentioned that a few sessions ago. Talking about soul, we mean the intellect, we mean the emotion, and we mean the um, one other element. Soul. You have intellect. We have will. Yes, will and emotion. So, and it says, look, I'm able to win all men because I've learned the process of transformation. Where I need to, I can be as sheep. Where I need to, I can be as serpent. And where I need to, I can be as dove. I have mastered the ability to be all things to all men, which means I'm able to adapt and transform and integrate with any environment. So influence in the systems require the capacity to transform and adapt to the system. Now, I didn't say adopt. Adapt means I can function in that environment without being that environment. So winning souls, which is a concept that certain people will be familiar with. We're talking about winning hearts and mind. It requires one word: wisdom. Wisdom is the capacity or ability to apply the knowledge to specific situations and environments. So winning souls, therefore, require wisdom. Winning heart and mind require wisdom. Now, I mean, there are a number of examples that I may want to share, but we don't have all the time. There's this man Joseph, and being in Egypt, he was able to apply his knowledge for the salvation for the national salvation. Salvation simply means that it was able to save the environment and prevent it from destruction through famine. That was Joseph. There's also this gentleman, a statesman actually, and a secretary of state in his time, Daniel. His work ethic was the distinguishing thing that made him tremendously influential in pagan Babylon, to the point that the the king could recommend him personally. And of course, there's Nehemiah, who his trustworthiness was actually his key to his influence in ancient Persia. So these are just some examples. No, let's begin to wrap up now as we talk about the principle of influence. Now, you must be in a position of influence to influence the systems. I mean, this is one way I can wrap this context up. We must be in a position of influence. Now, I did not say we must have a title. No, I mean, we must be in a position where we are able to influence the system. Okay, now I'm going to read a story. This story has been read in many ways, but I found a translation that seemed to apply to our context. And it says, there was a little town without many people in it. So a powerful king attacked it because he thought, oh, they don't have number is a disadvantage to them. So a powerful king attacked it. He surrounded it and prepared to break through the wall. So in the ancient times, they will lay siege around the wall so that nobody can go out or come in. And then they begin to break the wall at strategic points. Okay, so now someone lived there who was poor, but so clever that he could have saved the town. That's where I'm going. So poor, I mean, it was poor, but so clever. That combination is interesting. Poor but clever. To the point that he could have saved the town, but no one thought about him. Now, my question is that really the picture of people who have been commissioned to teach, But then no one is listening because the capacity to be listened to just seems not to be present. And that's why we are looking at this. And looking at what we need to address to be in a position to bring about the needed influence that our world desperately needs. Now, it could have saved the town. It was could have, should have, might have, could have, but no one thought about him. Which means poverty of influence could actually destroy a city and indeed a nation. Poverty of influence could destroy a company. Poverty of influence could destroy environments. And might this be why our environment seems to be, increasingly in danger? Because the people who have the capacity to influence or to bring about the needed change, benefit, are actually poor in influence. Think about that. So, just to put it in context and to wrap it up, we always have to remember that what we know and are able to apply brings about, the intended change. And we can begin from this point that, when we're talking about the worlds, the nations, communities, we are talking about people. Don't forget the world and the people in it. So when you talk about worlds, you are always talking about people. People are in worlds. People are in nations. People are in communities. People are in corporations. People are in worlds. So communities and nations are people. I mean, that just tells. I mean, it strips out the mystery or the myth around it. We're talking about people. Community and business leaders are people. So always reduce everyone to people. People are people. And it's not actually reduction. It's always look at everyone as people. That's what they are. A president is a person. And if it's a person, then they have certain characteristics which we're going to look at. Government is actually a word with language. So you can substitute that word government for any other thing. Businesses, communities, they are words and they are attributes that they have. Number one, language. They have culture. They have vocabulary. They have systems. They have problems and they are looking for solutions. And the solution they are looking for is your power. Is your avenue, is your access code to bring influence into those environments. Now, when I say language, just very quickly, the language of government is not hallelujah. The government of government is not goat and sheep. I mean, I don't mean to go in that song, but it's to reinforce the point that each word has its language. Now, one of the languages of the financial world is net profit. Is what are the others? Demand and supply. That's a language of the world of economics. Now, one of the languages of the word of law is to talk about the Constitution, talk about rights. Now, if somebody is poor in language, the person cannot have access to influence that particular world. Now, there's also the culture of those worlds. You remember that time before Joseph could bring about a solution. He had the solution, but one of the things he did was to first shave his head, and he got himself ready to have access into the presence of influence. Pharaoh was the influence, but Joseph had the solution, but he needed access into the presence of influence. Vocabulary. Some of these guys, Daniel and Nehemiah, they knew how to address kings. They would say, "Oh, king, live forever." I mean, religious folks would think, "Oh, what do you mean? Nobody can live forever." But that was the access code. That was the vocabulary of that environment.